This is Stone Cold Export, and today we are testing a specific CPU and GPU combo, namely the Ryzen R5 3600 and the RTX 3060 Ti. Two parts that are kinda hard to get a hold of at the moment, but we'll test them anyway. So the R5 3600 launched at 200 USD MSRP, and looking at PC Part Picker, it is in stock at a couple of places for that price. That's not true for the 3060 Ti though, which appears to be still out of stock everywhere, but it was supposed to have an MSRP of $399, I think. Hopefully availability improves soon, and for this test I used a 5600X as sort of a baseline or reference to see how much performance you leave on the table going with an R5 3600 instead of a 5600X or an Intel equivalent. I used the B550M Pro 4 from ASRock with the latest BIOS update, and I used 16GB of 200MHz CL16 memory, as that is what most people are running. At least according to PC Part Picker, that's the most popular DIMMs. So I did use PBO and LROC for this comparison, so the R5 3600 had a boost speed of 4400MHz and the 5600X had a boost of 4850MHz. The cooler was a Hyper 2-on-2 Black Edition from Cooler Master, and again it's something fairly cheap that most people can afford. And the GPU was the Asus RTX 3060 Ti Dual OC, which is a good model, which I do recommend. The price though is supposed to start at 400 USD, but given the current situation I was unable to find the price for this particular model. And price-wise, I think the 3060 Ti and 3600 is a well-balanced system, at least given the MSRPs. But let's see how it stacks up against the new 5600X. I tested at 1080p, 1440p and 4K in 6 titles, and we start off with Assetto Corsa Competitzione. This game does seem to favor the new 5600X. It was 24% faster at 1080p here, and we are running a race around Spa with 32 cars, which is pretty sort of CPU intensive. We are starting to become GPU bottlenecked at 1440p, where the lead is down to 5%, and at 4K we are completely GPU bound with both CPUs performing the same. So we move on to the next title, which is Battlefield 5. Here both AMD CPUs perform the same at 1080p with over 160 frames per second on average, moving up to 1440p, and we are pretty much GPU bottlenecked here, and at 4K we are, well, totally GPU limited. And if we take a look at the CPU comparison I did a few weeks back, we can see that the R5 3600 is maxed out at 167 frames per second on average with the RX 6800 GPU, and the 5600X is able to go beyond 200 frames per second. This indicates that with the 3060 Ti, the 3600 is almost at its limits, at least in Battlefield 5. So let's move on to the next title and see how it looks there. So the next title is Call of Duty Warzone, and for this benchmark I entered a match and went to the area outside of the quarry. With over 100 active players, we do see some interesting results here. The 5600X is 25% faster at 1080p, and in this case it means the difference between staying above 144 frames per second and below 144 frames per second, which is something to keep in mind for people running a 144Hz display and playing competitive games like this. This doesn't hold true for all competitive titles though. If we take a look at Rainbow Six Siege now, here we are running 100% render scaling with ultra settings, and at 1080p we are GPU bound, and both CPUs deliver very good performance here with over 350 frames per second on average. You can lower the render scaling to 50% for more performance, but I question the point when you are already pushing over 300 frames per second on average. And even at 1440p, both CPUs maintained over 200 frames per second on average, and it's only at 4K, where we are dropping down to 113 frames per second, that one might consider dropping the resolution scaling for more performance. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077. I debated how to benchmark this game for a while, but ultimately I did decide to benchmark it how I play it, with ray tracing on Ultra and DLSS enabled. Even at 1080p we have to engage DLSS at quality mode to stay above 60 frames per second on average, and even though this game does push the CPUs pretty hard, both seem to perform about the same. There's a slight edge to the 5600X at 1080p here. At 1440p we are dropping down to DLSS balanced and to try to maintain 60 frames per second, but the 3060 Ti isn't quite getting us there. and at 4K I had to drop to performance mode, but we are still only getting 37 frames per second on average, which is not really playable. I mean, it's playable, but it's not as smooth as 60, and you do notice that it is below 60. So it's not a great gaming experience. Next up is Ghost Recon Breakpoint. At 1080p, the 3600 and 3060 Ti are doing pretty good, but we are able to squeeze out about 6% more performance with these 5600X. And moving to 1440p and 4K, we are getting limited by our GPU and not our CPU, so both CPUs perform the same. The last game is Shadow the Tomb Raider, and I'm not using the built-in benchmark for this particular run. Instead, I take a run through a NPC heavy area, which seems to hit the CPU pretty hard, and the result is that the 5600X is 8% faster than the 3600 at 1080p, and although I would have no problem with the 3600's performance, at 1440p there's only a 3% difference between these two CPUs, and if you move up to 4K we are entirely limited by our GPU and not the CPU. Now let's take a look at relative performance across these 7 games. At 1080p you get 8% more performance going with a 5600X over a 3600, and that's not really worth it given the 50% price increase over the 3600. At 1440p we are for the most part GPU limited, which means the CPU doesn't make much of a difference, so it's definitely not worth it for 1440p gaming with a 3060 Ti. And at 4K we are totally limited by our GPU, and that means that both CPUs deliver pretty much exactly the same performance. In conclusion then, I think the 3600 and 3060 Ti combination is a very good match, especially for 1440p gaming. However, if you are aiming for 144 frames per second in most titles and you're dropping settings to try to achieve that, the 5600X or an Intel 10600K or 10700K would have an easier time hitting that target. You should be able to get close with a 3600 with tuned memory as well, but you would have to put in more work than with the other CPUs, which you can basically just run to 200 MHz CL16 and you will get over 144 frames per second in a lot of titles. The other issue is that the Intel Core i5-10400 is a good bit cheaper than the 3600 at this point in time, and they have pretty similar performance as we have seen in past videos. And well, again, it wouldn't be my top choice for 144 frames per second or 144 Hz gaming or above, but it does compare very well to the R5 3600, and the LGA 1200 platform is also getting an upgrade in the not too distant future with the Rocket Lake CPUs, so you might want to hold on buying a CPU until then. They probably won't be as cheap as the current CPUs, I'm sure, but they are finally moving away from Skylake cores, and although the latest CPUs and GPU releases have been a mess, let's hope Rocket Lake won't be. That's it from me for now, and take care and farewell.